people are looking for many different things in life, and everybody defines what they're looking for in different ways. And happiness is something that people want. Joy is something that people want. Bliss is such a different concept. I hear people, I see it every now and then. I don't think it's mainstream by any means, but follow your bliss is what people will say. But sometimes what happens is when very elevated words enter the mainstream, then people completely lose connection with what those words actually mean. The word avatar is it's just been horribly corrupted to the point almost of blasphemy, that it's just assumed a meaning that it doesn't have at all. An avatar is a fully God-realized master who descends into the material plane for the salvation of others. It's not the character that you assume in a video game. It's like the meaning of that word is sacred. And of course, it's a small thing, and it's absurd for someone like me to take a stand against such trivial things. But what happens then is when you want to really talk about an avatar, you have no word anymore, because it's been co-opted and it's been demeaned. So people doing that, they must have thought it was clever when they did it. I mean, there was a movie called Avatar and so on. On one hand, you're glad that the words are being used. On the other hand, it makes you heartsick. When what I'm doing becomes mainstream, I realize it's time for me to move way over, because what I am doing is not mainstream. What I'm doing is so far from mainstream that if it doesn't show, we need to move over to make it show, which gets more difficult the more established you get. Now, coming back to the word bliss, when you reach a certain level of understanding in your spiritual life, you begin to understand that bliss is really something else. Part of the problem is that these are English words, and English words are imprecise in their meaning, whereas Sanskrit words are extremely precise in their meaning. The word Ananda, which is the name of our community, can be translated as bliss. It can be translated as joy. It can also be translated as the word God. Ananda is a word for God. God is a very strange word in English because it has absolutely no meaning until you apply a theology to it. So when people have disputes about the nature of God and whether they believe in God, they're actually just arguing over ideas that have been imposed upon them. Many times people will have come and they'll say, well, I don't believe in God. I say, well, why don't you explain to me what you don't believe in? And then they'll tell me what they don't believe in, which is usually some theology that's been imposed upon them, which generally speaking is something really not to believe in. But we don't have the right words because English-speaking people were not interested in consciousness. We were interested in making the world work, which is not an unspiritual pursuit. It's just different. And the people who spoke Sanskrit were interested in understanding consciousness. So they had hundreds of words for the word God, for example, each one of which had a slight nuance of implication based on your actual experience. And that's the real difference. In the West, a lot of theology is just intellectual ideas. In the ideal of the Eastern teaching, it's all about your experience. So you can say a word like joy, or you can say a word like bliss, and people will still impose upon that word the narrowness or expansiveness of their own experience, but at least we'll be talking about something that we all can attach ourselves to in something that has to do with my authentic reality, not just my ideas about reality. So the word bliss is an elevated word from joy, and the word joy is an elevated word from the word happy, even though happy, joy, bliss could all sound the same. And the problem with the very popular idea, follow your bliss, is depending on what you define bliss to be, how you even perceive whether you're having it, because The difficulty is, in the material world, we tend to experience life, we do experience life from the perspective of the ego. And we experience life so steadily and completely from the perspective of the ego that we don't even know it's a perspective. We just think it's reality. The infinite self, the jiva, which is the spark of divinity, becomes identified with limitation. And then it begins to perceive its well-being and its self-interest in terms of that limitation. So almost everyone who lives on a material plane, to some extent, and many people completely, just identify with the body that they've incarnated in. And what that brings with it is the whole story of the family I was born into, the way I was raised, what happened between me and my siblings, my parents. And a person may even identify to the extent of, my heritage, my grandparents, and there's lots of theories about who you are now based on who your family used to be relatives that you never met. Ancestors is what I mean by that. All of us come into this world fully ourselves, and we are describing the forces with which we choose to associate, because those are the appropriate forces for us to work out the karma, whatever karma that might be. And this is where the law of karma becomes extremely challenging if one has chosen to associate him or herself with very difficult circumstances. If you've chosen to be abused, if you've chosen to be involved with evil people, if you've chosen a life of suffering or sacrifice, it gets it's a huge spiritual challenge to see that as part of a cosmic plan in which you participated, in which it was not imposed upon you, but that your own karma drew you to that. And I never ask anyone to embrace that until they're ready. I chose to associate with very supportive and positive circumstances, so it's easy for me to say it. But when somebody tells me that they had alcoholic parents, that they were abused as a child, that they're refugees from war, just all the things that really happen to children, naturally a person doesn't want to say, I chose this. It takes time, a very long time, before everything aligns sufficiently for one to be able to feel that is true. But the problem with the law of karma is it's either always true or it's never true. And so it's just a challenge that you just have to put on the shelf if it's too much at this point. All of us choosing to associate with those forces, we tend to feel that our state of consciousness is influenced by the conditions in which we live. And we believe that because we have identified with it. If you don't identify with it, it happens, but it doesn't really happen to you. You can see things that are happening at a distance, you can see them, you can even feel sympathy for them, but they're not happening to you. Master has this amazingly challenging phrase: people make a mistake of thinking that everything that happens to them concerns them personally. And I can still say that, and I still, my mind just tilts. Of course it concerns me personally if it happens to me, but that's only because I identify with it. Swami Kriyananda so succinctly described what it is to live your life but not identify with it. He said, I consider Swami Kriyananda an event for which I am responsible. To not identify with the limitation does not mean that you are free of the limitation. It just means that you operate within it from just this tiny step backwards. And therefore, my happiness is not conditioned by what happens in the world of limitation. Because I have not identified with that limitation, I merely operate through it. Hard times do go through us. And if we're committed to the event, we have to be committed to seeing that hard time through. So it's not like we always go through with a smile on our face. It's not like you never curl up in the fetal position on the floor and just cry until you can't cry anymore. Part of the commitment to this experience is that you have to feel it. We think that not to be identified with it means not to be committed to it and therefore not to feel it. But much of the time when people don't allow themselves to actually experience it, much of the time, it's not because they've transcended it, it's because they're afraid of it. Swami remarked about someone else, so-and-so appears to be more detached than I am. He said, but he's just less committed. Because one of the ways we protect ourselves from suffering is to not be committed. But if you're committed, you have to go through the whole thing. You have to go through the betrayal, the disappointment, and you have to feel it all the way through. But it's an event that we have to see through. If a person's children are suffering, you have to go through that. If someone that you love leaves this planet or betrays you in some way, you can't just pretend that that's not really happening, because it is really happening. And if you're committed to the life, you have to live through it. But that little bit of it being an event, not myself, is what allows you to stand back and realize this is a hard time going through me. It's going through me. I'm not going through it, but it's going through me, and we're really having this experience. And this is where the subtlety of happiness, joy, bliss, all really counts. And coming all the way back, this planet, being a very Rajasic planet, very active and we are so Rajasic. We're just always, always busy. Just walk out and all the cars are whizzing and everybody's doing something. And we're just a very Rajasic planet. We don't sit around. The whole planet in America is a very Rajasic country. But the ego's basic MO is ease and pleasure. And that's just how the ego orients itself. We want it, if it's not easy, we think of it as bad. If it's not pleasurable, we think of it as bad. Our fallback position and our definition of good is easy and pleasurable. And so when things are easy and pleasurable, we call them happy. And we say we're happy because it's easy and pleasurable. My kids are doing great. My job is working really well. My house is comfortable. I managed to win the political party, got elected the one I wanted. My mother-in-law went back to Minnesota, whatever it might be that really makes it easy and more pleasurable for us. We call that good. But when money is tight, when the kids are in trouble, when the relationship has fallen apart, when the job is dicey, then we call that bad. And we even say that, bad karma, good karma. Because easy and pleasurable. And when we're identified with this, we want it to be easy and pleasurable. But if we're recognizing that this is an event that I have to go through and that my actual reality is something else, then we think of it very, very differently. And if that actual reality is related to self-realization and our eternal experience, then ease and pleasure is less important than bliss. Because bliss is not dependent on ease or pleasure. And that's what we're looking for. What's important is that whatever hard time necessarily must go through me is going to ultimately free me. And no matter whether it's easy or pleasurable, what really awaits me on the other side of it is not ease and pleasure, but bliss. And even just that understanding that bliss is a victorious state. Bliss is not the state that comes to us when all obstacles are removed. Bliss is the state that comes to us when obstacles are no obstacle, because they're just something that has to be done. And if we are completely materialistic in our understanding of reality and have no identity beyond the physical body, which is how many people live in this world, and their point of view is, just make myself as comfortable as I can, take whatever I want if I can get it, and if I can die still holding it, that's a victory. And that basically is the philosophy of our country right now, which is one of the reasons we have all the politicians we have. We have become committed to the idea, if I can get it for myself and hold on to it, why shouldn't I get it? Because there's no identification with anything greater than the limitation I'm living in, and I want to please it. And no greater reality, no karma, no nothing. And this is what the whole planet has been building to for a long time. And so now we see it really happening. But when we step out of that, you have to have reincarnation, you have to have karma. Because without those, the other point of view makes perfect sense. But without those, you might manage, if your karma is good, I mean, if forces are aligned, you might be happy, even happy for a while. But bliss is something else, because happy depends on conditions matching your preferences. Bliss is your natural state, your natural divine state that comes to you when your state of consciousness is not dependent on the limiting conditions in which you find yourself. So earlier on, someone asked, how can you cultivate bliss without yogic principles? The answer is you can't. You can manage to sneak through an incarnation every once in a while, but even that, Swamiji just commented, he said, it just all depends on your past karma. If you set yourself up by doing the right things enough, then you might have smooth sailing. But right now, in our country, in our world, we're just watching lots of powerful, successful, famous people. Just, their karma's catching up with them. And somebody who was at the top is now at the bottom. It's just, and it's so common. But when we get our own world set up with pleasure and ease, we imagine that we are the exception and that my world is going to stay. The actual long metaphysical explanation of it has to do with the chakras, with the energy pattern that we build up in the mechanics of resistance. You understand the mechanics by understanding what the chakras are, how the actions, how the fact that the ego identifies with limitation creates vibrations, habitual vibrations of consciousness, which become vrittis of energy in the chakras, which represent different levels of perception of reality, how those vrittis are carried on from one incarnation to another, how those vrittis define our karma, how our responses to life are based on those vrittis. As you can see, it's a long story. For those who end up watching this online later, I have a 4-part series on the chakras, which I highly recommend it. We are an energy pattern, and our response, our karma, is the magnetic field created by the energy pattern that I am, and that energy pattern is created moment by moment by my responses to the event for which I am responsible, measured on a spectrum from complete commitment to my separate reality as a material being and my understanding that I am part of infinity and I recognize myself as one with God. If you think of that as a spectrum of possibilities, because it's not either or. It's like sometimes we're very generous. Sometimes we're very elevated. Sometimes we're very selfish. Sometimes we're very afraid. Sometimes we identify greatly with our spiritual selves. Sometimes we're frantic to preserve our bodies. Sometimes we're very ego-sacrificing, self-sacrificing. Sometimes we just draw the tightest little circle around ourselves. And in the course of an hour, you can vary greatly. What to speak of a lifetime or a year or multiple incarnations. But because we identify with what happens to us, those vibrations, and if you think of this spectrum as like if you think of a piano, each note has a specific vibration that has a number that can be identified. On this spectrum from complete delusion to complete self-realization, every gradation of identification with limitation or lack of, or freedom from that identification, you might say it has a number. And every thought, every response, every reaction that we have to life reflects some perception of reality and some perception of where my happiness comes from and what causes me suffering. And it just falls somewhere on there according to what who we are and how far we have expanded our awareness. But because we identify, each one of those actions creates a certain commitment of energy, and that commitment of energy registers in the chakras, because the chakras represent this spectrum, and it creates a vortex of energy. And when the physical body dies, we go into the realm of energy, and that's the astral body, and it vibrates there exactly according to what it was in the material plane. The laws are a little different there, but the vibration is the same. And then when those vibrations that require a material incarnation become too insistent, we find ourselves reincarnated, drawn to where we are. So each of those vrittis of energy, those habitual ways of responding when something happens, those vrittis are magnetic pools. They're whirlpools of energy. So the thought comes, oh, my mother is dying. And there's a whole series of habitual responses to my mother dying, which could be, I've never liked the woman, I'm glad she's getting off the planet, to what will I ever do once this wonderful person leaves me? And those are habitual ideas based on the experiences we've had, the responses to it, and the energy we've stored. And it's an active force. You call it resistance, but I just call it an active force. We're not a clean slate. Something enters in, and all of these vibrating whirlpools try to grab it. And it's a magnetic relationship. If you think of a river flowing with a whole lot of whirlpools, the flow of the river toward the ocean has a certain power. The whirlpools have a certain power. And it's just a matter of the dynamic between them. And if something difficult comes to us and we have a certain amount of spiritual practice, if that spiritual practice is strong enough, then our concentration may suddenly flow to the sea. If our spiritual practice is semi-strong, it'll get drawn into whichever whirlpool is the strongest. And if I have to take care of myself, no one's ever going to take care of me, other people are no damn good, they all just betray me, I need to get in there and get what I can for myself, has been an habitual response. And the thing about the chakras, the vrittis, the karma, is it's mathematical. It's metaphysics. It's not, there's no judge thinking about you. There's no corrupt politicians. It's just mathematics. And so whatever you are is what happens. And every time we continue to reaffirm the same reality, it just gets stronger. It's pennies in a jar, and the jar gets fuller and fuller. Even if we resist that reality, then we get to put half a penny in a higher reality, and only half a penny goes into this one. If we do Kriya, or some kind of meditation that greatly strengthens the flow of the river toward the sea, then we get more and more powerful, not only to resist those whirlpools, but if the flow of the river is strong enough, whirlpools get absorbed into the river and literally disappear. So what happens to everyone on the spiritual path, if they're sincere in practice at all, is that things will happen to you in your life, and you realize that you, just without even any thought, respond differently. What used to really upset you simply doesn't. You know, what used to frighten you doesn't frighten you anymore, because the power of the ocean, of the river flowing to the sea, has become strong enough that whirlpools you didn't even know were there were dissolved without your even knowing it, until something happens and you say, wow, I sure handled that well. I'm going to come back to what Rita was saying at the very beginning, when she was talking about, planning these programs and having intuition at the moment of what to do, coming in and finding out that I know what to do. Now, posited against it is great anxiety, not being able to make a decision, just concerned about all the choices, anxiety about arriving there and not knowing what to do, not having the confidence that I can solve this problem, because all of those are, well, to use Larry's phrase, those are the story we may have been telling ourselves for a long time. I am weak, I am small. when unexpected things happen, I can't handle it. I need to be physically strong in order to succeed. I'm crippled because of what happened to me when I was a child. These are all responses on the spectrum between God realization and complete materialism. And every single time we make one of those responses, it just goes wherever it belongs. And when we work, doing meditation, doing right things, we create new whirlpools of a more elevated kind, and we increase the flow of the river. So that this new whirlpool takes our attention a lot. Oh, I have to be worried. I just don't know what's going to happen. Actually, I don't. And how that happens? That happens, well, Master said, take care of the minutes and the incarnations will take care of themselves. I mean, that is a really big span. Minutes versus incarnations, because you see the minutes create that energy pattern, and then that energy pattern determines the incarnations. If I have another body, which I have always presumed that I will, I hope to have from the age of 1, where I'm not quite so identified with the experience I'm having, and I can just calculate it in terms of an event and keep the event running as it's supposed to run. You know, that's what we're really working for, because that's where bliss comes from. Bliss comes from identifying with our own greater reality. And we get glimpses of this, or we have some intuitive recognition of it. We have some experience. Everybody comes to it in some way or another, which is to a certain extent how I would characterize myself. We have the good fortune to have faith in a great master or a great spiritual person in our lives. And we realize that they're telling us the truth. And we see in their expression of life a potential for myself. And even if I don't myself actually know what that potential is, I've seen it manifested. My life with Swami Kriyananda, he was so inspiring. Not because he never struggled, but because he faced into whatever he had to do. And what he did is he pulled down the principles according to the spiritual principles, according to the spiritual truth. His faith in the path of self-realization, in the path of discipleship to master, in the process of Kriya, in the law of karma, in the chakras and reincarnation, his consistent faith in the face of enormous challenges made me realize that just this has to be true. And the fruit that I would see manifested in this world, manifested in his power, manifested in his inspiration, that's what I want to be. That was my first thought when I saw Swami Kriyananda in 1969. In the first minute I saw him, he has what I want. Look at that consciousness. That's how it just came to me. You know, look at that. Look at what's possible. I already knew it in theory, but I'd never seen it. As soon as I saw it, I thought, whatever he's doing, I have to do that. And then you do. And then gradually, it's not that you get happy all the time, because this is a hard climb. You know, this is a very steep mountain. I used to really love to read those mountain climbing stories, the Everest stories, Annapurna, you know, just incredible stories. I don't know why, of these freezing people staggering up these hills, losing their toes, you know, just craziness. And of course, the thought would cross my mind, why? Why are they doing that? But just the fact that they would do that just really, I mean, I have zero interest in mountain climbing, but they were just stories of extraordinary perseverance against obstacles and an absolute commitment to what they were doing. And so it translates into the spiritual life. And that's why you have to have the word bliss, because if you just have the word happiness or even the word joy, not every day is a good day. But there's another level. And again, you have to understand, it's not that you're always living in that level. But if you're climbing Mount Everest, that you know that the top is there. And even if you're lost in the fog, and even if you're going down before you're going to go up again, you know that the top of the mountain is there. And whatever it is, it's worth it to you to get there. for whatever you think it's going to give you, regardless of whether it's true or not. In that context, it motivates you to heroic measures way beyond yourself because you know it's up there. And so when these masters constantly talk to us about bliss, it's really important to understand it's not like we're always going to be in that state. But if one becomes persuaded, and that persuasion is extremely personal and very deeply internal, but there just becomes a point where you can't get away from it. Deep spiritual experiences, whether it's 28 days in India or whether it's one meditation, are like radioactive substances. And you know, if radioactivity is planted within you, it just keeps radiating until the whole organism is mutated by the radiation. And so these deep spiritual experiences plant in your heart something that continues to vibrate. And even though your conscious mind may have forgotten it, this is where there's the poetic phrase, one moment in the company of a saint can be your raft over the ocean of delusion. One moment in the company of someone who can awaken within you that awareness of your potential, even if you forget, it'll just keep radiating. Edgar Cayce, who did these past life readings for people in the 40s and the 50s, many people, he said, you were on the streets of Jerusalem and Jesus walked by and he looked at you. I mean, that would be the whole encounter. And everything that's happened to you in the 2,000 years since has been based on that, which is the gradual shifting of your awareness in relation to God consciousness. And so, you know, that's what we're doing. Somewhere or another, the concept of bliss has entered into our sphere. And the more powerfully it's entered, the more powerfully motivated we are, even if we don't know why. We just don't progress in a straight line. Let's go back to climbing Mount Everest. You know, it's not just straight up like that. They have to go up and down and up and down and up and down. You're always progressing, but it doesn't always look like you're progressing. And so the most important yogic principle for understanding bliss is perseverance. I really think it may actually be the most important yogic principle, is the fact that if you don't quit, you will succeed. And even if you quit, you will succeed. That our degree of suffering is entirely dependent upon our determination not to suffer, that has become so authentic that we are actually willing to face into those things that cause us to suffer. And it's a very subtle balance point in the mind, because we become persuaded of false ideas. And we become persuaded of false ideas, we become proud of those ideas, we become committed to those ideas, and we're just not willing to let them go. Maybe we absorb them from our families, from something that we read, from some previous incarnation. It took me so long to understand the difference between guilt and self-effort, and how being guilty was not the same as actually resolving to change. I just could not see. I just couldn't see it. So I just had to repeat it for a very, very long time until finally the suffering that I experienced from that was less than the suffering I thought I would experience from facing into my limitation and putting out the effort to change it. And it's a very subtle, and it's the karmic balance. And once we have any idea that liberation is possible, then it's just a matter of not quitting. This is one of those things where people come in and they say they don't believe in God, and I ask them, what God don't you believe in? And the God they don't believe in is the one that looks a lot like them. You know, the one that's judgmental and unforgiving and unrealistic and demanding and harsh and so on. And that's who we imagine. But comforter, think about what that means. And think about what it would mean, what it does mean, if our conception of God is the comforter. And so then we think about what the ideal mother is, whether you had it physically in your life or not. What is the ideal mother? What is ideal mother love? She's just always there. She creates you out of her own body, and she feeds you through her own self. And if that's where we always go back to, that's bliss. It doesn't mean that the war doesn't rage around you, but it means that you can always crawl onto the lap of the comforter. Cosmically, this whole rebellion against patriarch and the necessity to assert the feminine, the feminine, is actually what's trying to happen. It's getting totally warped. So it's become a war between women and men, which is the most horrible aberration of what's trying to happen, or that women are trying to assert themselves by being more male than men. But what's really trying to happen is the feminine principle, which is compassion, forgiveness, human values, is trying to balance the masculine, not overtake, but simply balance. That's what Divine Mother is, and that's what's trying to happen. And it has to start at the highest level. And the highest level is our relationship to God, bringing it down in this new way. And when it changes us, if you really know that God is your Divine Mother, and there's nothing you can do to separate yourself from her ever, and there's nothing you can do that will ever change the unconditional nature of her love, think of the comfort that brings you. I mean, that's the yogic principle of bliss. It's not that you're happy all the time, but well, the way I love to say it, if it isn't the happy ending, it's not the ending yet. Because the story has a happy ending. And so if we haven't gotten there yet, that just means we have another chapter.